All right. So we start a new book of the Torah today, the book of Leviticus, known as VaYikra in Hebrew, and in the Eitz Chaim, it's on 585. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So no matter what edition of Chumash you're using, if you have the Hertz Chumash there, I'm sure Rabbi Hertz has an introduction to the book of Leviticus before the text actually begins, and so too Eitz Chaim has an introduction as well, not just from the Bible scholar who's kind of in charge of providing the background for the book. Each book of the Torah in Eitz Chaim has a different scholar providing the background. So this is the background on 584. And then if we look below the line on 585, we'll see that that commentary extends all the way to 586, entirely on 586. And I was curious regarding the other books of the Torah and how extensive the introductions are. They are not as extensive as the introduction to this book of the Torah. So, which is interesting because the book of Genesis, you would think would have an extensive introduction just in terms of, how we understand or how the Torah presents God in relation to the universe. So that would be an extensive theological discussion, you would imagine. Or the introduction of the book of Exodus about the formation of the family of Jacob into the nation of Israel and the experience at Mount Sinai, et cetera, et cetera. So Leviticus has the lengthiest introduction, probably because the commentary is going out of its way to try to make the topic of the book relevant to us today. And the topic of the book of VaYikra, which we can't tell from the Hebrew word, which is just the very first word of the book, often how a portion of the Torah and how a book of the Torah is called. It's based on the first word in the verse, VaYikra, and he called. The topic of the book of Leviticus is based on the Greek name, which is about the Leviim, the Levites. Laws related to the Levites, to the tribe of Levi, and the subset of the tribe of Levi, the Kohen. That's right. People who are Kohanim are a subset of the tribe of Levi. Okay, so it's not the people who are Kohanim, like Gabe on this Zoom call, is really a Levite, but he's of the subset of Kohanim. Okay, it just turns out that people who do genetic studies know that anybody who's a Kohen has a particular genetic marker that is 3,000 years old, which just so happens to be around the time of when the concept of Kohen came into existence. So it's just fascinating. Anybody who's a Kohen who would want to subject him or herself to DNA testing, I don't know if there's, I remember on National Geographic or Smithsonian or something like that, where they did a study of people who are Kohanim. So I don't know if you can just go to any random doctor's office and ask for the genetic marker study to be done if you're a Kohen, but it exists. Okay, so that's the topic of the book is laws, particularly for Levites and Kohanim, especially regarding sacrifices. Okay, and because of that, so several things about that. Some might say in the non-Orthodox world that even the laws related to Kohen and Levi might be anachronistic. That, in other words, in modern non-Orthodox synagogues, the role of the Kohen or Levi has really diminished. We are among the few conservative synagogues that still call the first aliyah and save it for Kohen, the second aliyah, save it for Levi. There are many conservative synagogues who are egalitarian, not just about gender, women and men being equal, but also about democratizing the congregation and doing away with Kohen and Levi status and just having number 1, 2, 3 in that order. So it doesn't matter anymore in many conservative synagogues, and I think all Reform synagogues, doesn't matter at all that you're born a Kohen or Levi, because it's all really symbolic today. The only thing a Kohen, and again, we're one of the few conservative synagogues in the country that still has the Kohanim provide the blessing on festivals, right? We call up the Kohanim for something called duchanin, because it's from the word duchan, which is platform. We invite the Kohanim up during the festival Musaf service, also Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, to bless the congregation as a reminder of how the Kohanim would bless the congregation every day in the temple in Jerusalem. So we make that egalitarian. So women and men Kohanim are invited up to do that blessing. So again, one of the few conservative synagogues still around that do that. It's not done in Reform synagogues. One of the few conservative synagogues that still do Kohen and Levi to be called up to the Torah. And the only other thing that Kohanim would do if they take being a Kohen seriously is not go to a funeral or go to a cemetery unless, God forbid, they are the ones who would be saying Kaddish for the person for whom that funeral is, right? So if it's a Kohen can only go to a funeral or enter the cemetery if it's for the Kohen's father, mother, spouse, brother, sister, or child. Okay, otherwise, Kohen stays away from a funeral or from the cemetery. Okay, so even that is symbolic because the Torah says in the book of VaYikra that the Kohen is supposed to remain pure. So, but it's impossible to be pure today because the only way to be pure is through the special purification process that only could happen in the temple in Jerusalem. And since the temple was destroyed 2,000 years ago, everyone's impure today. It doesn't, so there's nothing we can do about that. So it's only symbolic. So when we wash our hands after leaving a cemetery, or some people do it when going into a shiva house, there's a pitcher of water there by the front door. That's symbolic, that washing of hands. And it's also symbolic when we wash hands before saying hamotzi, because we can't really be fully purified until we have, as the book of Numbers, chapter 19 describes, the red heifer ashes purification ceremony. Okay, so all of that is why the Eitz Chaim goes out of its way in its introduction to make this relevant for us as the reader, as we are now going to be spending the next several weeks in synagogue on Shabbat and Monday and Thursday morning reading from the book of Leviticus. How do we find relevance and spiritual meaning from this when clearly it's referring to, it can only be fully observed when the temple was standing 2,000 years ago. Okay, so I'd like to look at the introduction that's on page 584, and we'll also look below the line on 585, and I think that's all we'll have time for today, because the portion itself, which is the first 5 chapters of the book of Leviticus, this weekly portion this week, starts to present the material about the variety of sacrifices that are offered in the Mishkan, the portable sanctuary in the desert, and later in the temple in Jerusalem. So some of those sacrifices are named today and will continue in next week's portion too. So Baruch Levine, a noted Bible scholar, wrote this introduction, popularly called by the Hebrew name VaYikra, he called, which is its first word, Leviticus is known formally in Hebrew as Torah Kohanim, instructions for the priests, or the Torah of the Kohanim. From the Mishnah, Megillah. This title defines Leviticus as a prescription for the proper worship of the God of Israel. Okay, so here's what you follow in order to worship God. All right, so if you ask a Jew today, how do we worship God? You pull a prayer book off the shelf. You ask an Israelite, not a Jew. The term Jew really only started around the time of the rabbis, near the time of the destruction of the temple. So that was a transition time. So before rabbis, we were called Israelites. You ask an Israelite how to worship God, you say, hey, you see that over there? That's the Mishkan, or that's the temple in Jerusalem. You go there to worship God. Not home, not, there's no Shabbos candlesticks in Israelite days. There's no Kiddush cup in Israelite days. So you can't, there's nothing to show. There's possibly not a Seder plate either to show. Is there menorah? Well, before 165 BCE, there's not even a Hanukkah menorah to show. So there's no ritual item to show. You could show a mezuzah on the doorpost of your house. That exists. It's unclear whether tefillin existed. Probably no talis and tefillin also until the time of the rabbis. So if you're going to show somebody what it means to be Jewish as an Israelite, you would just show them the mezuzah on your doorpost and point them to the temple in Jerusalem. Okay, the Hebrew Bible reflects the central concerns of the ancient Israelites. Perhaps the most vital of these concerns was to know how they were to express their loyalty to God. This very question is posed by the prophet Micah in chapter 6, who answers it by emphasizing the primacy of justice and love, ultimately desired by God more than sacrifice. So throughout the books of the prophets, not just Micah, but Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, even though they all talk about the importance of sacrifice, they talk about how the reason why the Israelites were punished is because they neglected the sacrifices. They neglected following through on behavior that reflected bringing the sacrifice. So the prophets would speak to the people and admonish them for bringing the sacrifice, and then in the very next step, as you're leaving the temple, neglecting the poor, neglecting the disadvantaged in the community, right? So the prophets talk, what God really wants us to do is to be just and loving people, as Micah would put it, to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. That's what Micah would say, right? But Leviticus 19, chapter 19, verse 2, gives a more specifically priestly answer. This commentary goes on to Micah's question: you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. So what does God want us to do? For the prophets, it means to do justice and to be loving. For the Torah, it's to be holy. So how Israel was to live as a holy nation is the burden of Leviticus. It's a whole question of what holiness means and how we can be holy, right? So we might argue that if we do justice and act with compassion and love, that's being holy. Okay, and that's what I would argue. And holy, there's one of the essays in the back of the Eitz Chaim is about holiness. Okay, and holiness, there's a lengthy article just in terms of how to translate the word, how to define the word, let alone how to be holy. So the word kadosh, usually, which is holy, usually is defined as separate, right? So there is holy, and then there is non-holy. So when we say Havdalah on Saturday night, Hamavdil ben Kodesh lechol, who separates between holy and what we would say is secular. Sometimes it's translated as profane. So profane in modern English, not, old English, profane means like a curse word. That's what comes to mind when I say the word profane. But it simply means in older English, not holy. But so more rightly translated as secular. So holy versus secular, holy versus weekday, right? The weekday of the holiday of Passover, the intermediate days, is called Chol HaMoed, the weekday of the festival. Okay, so when we say the blessing at the end of Havdalah, Hamavdil, we thank God for making distinctions like between holiness and secularness, ben Kodesh lachol, ben Or lachoshech, between light and dark, ben Yisrael la'amim, between Israel and other people, ben Yom HaShvi'i l'sheshet yemei ha'ma'aseh, between the seventh day and the 6 days of work, right? So these are the distinctions that the Havdalah prayer point out. So in one regard, Kodesh is the opposite of secular. So something that's elevated to a higher spiritual purpose. Okay, so things can be holy or set aside for a holy purpose, and people can be holy as well. So the book of Leviticus is a description of how people can become holy by bringing a sacrifice, going through a purification process. And then the subset of the nation of Israel, known as the Kohanim, who have to remain holy all the time. And then the chief Kohen, the high priest, who has on his garment, on his forehead, something that is written. So whenever he is working in the temple, the high priest has Kodesh Ladonai written on his forehead, holy, designated as holy to God, as we read in last week's portion, how the vestment was made for the high priest. Okay, so there's an average Israelite can be holy, and then the tribe of Levi is set aside for a holier purpose than the other tribes, right? We'll know in the book of Numbers that the tribe of Levi doesn't have a land holding in the land of Israel, because the tribe of Levi is supported from all the other tribes because of their holier purpose. And then the Kohanim, who are the subset of Levi, even holier than the Levites, and then the Kohen Gadol, the holiest of them all among the people of Israel. And it's the same for the land of Israel itself. The land of Israel is holy in relationship to other lands around it. And then Jerusalem is holier than the rest of the land of Israel. And then the temple is holier than the city of Jerusalem. And then the temple court, where the altar is holier than the rest of the temple. And then the Holy of Holies, in which only the Kohen Gadol enters on Yom Kippur, is the holiest place within the land of Israel, right? So land of Israel has its gradations. The people of Israel has its gradations of holiness as well. Okay, so that's what all of this, the book of Leviticus, is about, is the sense of holiness, which, can be argued is an important conversation to have spiritually as human beings today, right? Well, like, what is the meaning of life? And there's a variety of answers to that. You can have an ethical answer to the meaning of life, a philosophical answer to the meaning of life, a religious answer to the meaning of life. Okay, so a Jewish religious answer to the meaning of life is to understand that God exists and to exhibit that understanding in how we behave every moment that we're alive. And in one sense, the book of Leviticus helps us understand how to derive meaning from life, and that we're striving to be holy. That's the meaning of life. Now, the rest of this commentary might point out about how difficult it is to understand where does sacrifices, how does sacrificing an animal or a bird or bringing wheat or a handful of flour, how does that help make us holy? And that's difficult to relate to when we haven't done anything like that in 2,000 years. Unless you're ultra Orthodox and live in Borough Park in New York, or in Bnei Brak or Mea Sharim in Israel, when on the day before Yom Kippur, you're taking a chicken and swinging it over your head. Unless you're shlugging kaparas, as they say, and then take that chicken to the butcher to be slaughtered, you have no experience at all with anything that the book of Leviticus is talking about, right? So non-ultra Orthodox Jews today have no experience with this at all, and that's the challenge. How do we take the concrete physical things that the book of Leviticus is talking about in terms of worship of God, and apply that to the abstract things that we do? Certainly there are physical things we do, light Shabbos candles, build a sukkah, bake challah or eat challah, pray, right? Pull out a prayer book and pray. These physical acts that we do are nowhere near the physicality of the book of Leviticus. Okay, no animals are harmed in any of the physical acts that we do as Jews today, right? And you can even argue, some would argue, that we should be vegetarian, so that even in the celebration of the festivals that we do, in terms of the food that we eat, no animals are harmed in that either. Okay, so vegetarians today have no relationship, and in fact, they would be totally opposed to what the book of Leviticus talks about. Okay, so the rest of this, the intro, just talks about how the book of Leviticus is structured. So we don't need to look at that. Let's turn to our attention to below the line on 585. Leviticus is a difficult book for a modern person to read with reverence and appreciation, right? That's what I've spoken about for the past 25 minutes is exactly what this first line is referring to. Its main subject matter, animal offerings and ritual impurity, seems remote from contemporary concerns, right? I didn't even go to the ritual purity and talk about that, because that's also totally beyond our realm of living, right? Unless you're in an Orthodox Jewish environment where a married woman will go to the mikveh every month, right? Only married women do this. Sometimes in the Orthodox world, men will go to the mikveh before Shabbat on Friday afternoon. But that's for a spiritual purpose, not for a purification purpose. The only purification that we have that's still here today from the book of Leviticus, that's still observed, is married women going to the mikveh while they still have their period. Okay, so married women who are 70 years old, no need to go to the mikveh anymore. Okay, you get my point. So because the mikveh is independent of the temple in Jerusalem. So that's the only purification thing that we do today that is independent of the temple in Jerusalem and can happen anywhere in the world. And you don't need a mikveh to be built in order to have that purification, right? A person who converts to Judaism also has to immerse in a mikveh, and it doesn't have to be a mikveh. It can be a live body of water. It's just that a mikveh is more private and usually warmer than going to a river or to an ocean or to a lake. But all those are acceptable bodies of water to immerse in for for purification purposes or for conversion? Does the conservative movement have a mikvah? So every metropolitan area in America has a mikvah, and the conservative movement. So in our area, Addis, Israel has a mikvah, which when it renovated its building in the early 90s, late 80s, they decided to build a mikveh there. So so this is a political thing when it comes to conversion, in that at the time, it's like a spa, right? Yes, that mikveh is almost like a spa. You can't get a massage there, but everything else about it looks like a spa. At the time, politically, Orthodox synagogues would not that would have a mikveh would not allow non-Orthodox Jews to use the mikveh, especially non-Orthodox rabbis to bring someone for conversion. That's not the case anymore. Ohav Shalom on 16th Street has a mikveh there, and they allow conservative rabbis to bring in candidates for mikveh, and I would imagine they would allow Reform rabbis to do it as well. So that's unusual, but that's getting more common today. In Philadelphia, there's a synagogue, Beth Hillel Bethel, that's in Lower Merion area, has a mikveh there. And in Boston, there's an independent mikveh called Mayim Chayim, Living Waters. So that's an independent mikveh that's not associated with any other synagogue at all. And then, so that's what I know of offhand. I would imagine Chicago has a non-Orthodox mikveh. I would imagine Los Angeles has one too. In Israel, it's an issue. I don't think that there's any conservative synagogue in Israel that has a mikveh, and conversion in Israel is done under the auspices of the chief rabbinate, and it's a whole political thing in Israel today. But okay, so right. So let's go back to below the line on 585. So the fifth line, yet almost half of the 613 mitzvot of the Torah are found in this book, the text with which young children traditionally began their Jewish education, right? So half of the 613 mitzvot are found in the book of Leviticus, most of which can not be observed until the temple is rebuilt, okay? Because a lot of them have to do with sacrifice, and a lot of them have to do with purification that goes hand in hand with being in a temple. So in other words, some of the mitzvot are related to skin rashes, what's used to be leprosy. The only way to be cured, to be spiritually cured of leprosy, is to go to the mikveh and to bring a bird as a sacrificial offering. Well, mikveh is one thing, can't bring the bird, so you can't do the leprosy, the skin rash things that are here, plus many, many other things. Can't bring the peace offering, a burnt offering, a sin offering, etc., etc. Our concern in reading Leviticus should be more than historical. That is, this is what our ancestors used to believe and practice. So, in other words, that shouldn't be the only reason to read the book, right? Because if you don't care about history, then you don't care about the book of Leviticus. It should be an effort to understand the religious needs that were met by these practices in ancient times, needs that we still confront today, and the religious ideas that were taught in the process, right? So that's what I was alluding to earlier, that the idea of trying to be holy is a timeless effort, right? It's not trying to be holy doesn't have to be associated with the temple in Jerusalem. It doesn't have to be associated with a particular practice or ritual. The attempt to try to be holy is also independent of any religion. All religions preach and teach how to be holy in that particular religion. So the effort, the attempt to be holy is not just a Jewish thing. And it's not just a temple-oriented or Mishkan-oriented thing. It's an eternal process. Okay, and that's what the commentary is going to try to teach us throughout the book of Leviticus, that don't get caught up in the particulars of the detail. Think instead in the bigger picture, what this is trying to teach us to do. The modern temper, the commentary goes on, tends to discount prescribed ritual in favor of spontaneous religious expression. Right? So that's would be an argument for Jews today. Don't tell me that I have to be Jewish by going to a synagogue. I want to be able to be Jewish on my own terms. You know, so if I see something beautiful in nature, I want to be able to respond to it right away. Don't tell me, oh, wait until mincha and associate that being in nature with a prayer that you'll find in the mincha service, right? That's just, so by associating religious sensibility with a particular ritual or prescribed behavior might take away from the spirituality of the moment, right? And so Jewish renewal movement and other movements in Judaism that have arisen counter to the set denominations of Judaism are all about that, are trying to get away from prescribed halacha and into more of the spontaneous, coming from the heart kind of emotion of Judaism. And I would argue, though, that you can find that from the heart stuff in the normative understanding of Judaism. I mean, that's how I find it, and but everybody's different. Yet something in the human soul responds to ritual, whether it be the formality of a traditional wedding or the rituals of a sporting event or a public meeting, right? Rituals sometimes are helpful to us, especially when it comes to death, right? God forbid. So no matter how difficult the circumstance of the death is, no matter how tragic it is, I've always found that the mourner finds incredible comfort knowing that there's something to do. So that the ritual of the funeral itself, okay, I have to come to the synagogue now. I have to go to the cemetery now. I have to do this now. I have to say this now. I have to wear this ribbon this way or rip my garment this way. All these things, these rituals, help the mourner not make sense of what happened, but gives them something to do and understand that there's this ritual that's been there for thousands of years too, that could provide comfort and consolation, right? And then the opposite is true too. Like, how do you celebrate love, which is an overwhelming emotion, with a wedding ceremony? So the wedding ceremony itself provides a format for this intense feeling. So it goes on. There is something comfortable about the familiar, the recognizable, the predictable. There is something deeply moving about performing a rite that is older than we are, one that goes back beyond the time of our parents and grandparents. At crucial times, it's important for us to know that we are doing it right. There is power in the knowledge that we are doing what generations of people before us have done in similar situations, something that other people in other places are doing at the same time and in the same way. Yeah, there is power in that, right? So that Friday night, the classic statement, more than the Jews have kept Shabbat, Shabbat has kept the Jews, right? So that by observing Shabbat, yes, it's one thing to know that Jews around the world light candles 18 minutes before sunset, right? Which is powerful to know that. But it's another thing that by doing that, Shabbat, on the other hand, is keeping us going too. So it's the duality that it's There's power in performance of the ritual, but there's also power in the ritual keeping the community together. So, and rituals, including prescribed prayers, tell us what to do and say at times when we cannot rely on our own powers of inspiration to know what to do or say. Right? That's how I understand praying 3 times a day. Right? Instead of being spontaneous, and the rabbis understood this when they debated what's more important, the habit, keva is the Hebrew word, the habit that is ritualized versus kavanah, the spontaneous intention. What's most important? Rabbis agreed that kavanah is important. That, that if you're just going through the motions of praying the morning service without even thinking about what you're saying, the rabbis would argue that that prayer was meaningless. But at the same time, if you wait until you feel spontaneously moved to pray, then you may not be praying every day, every week, every month, right? So the rabbis understood keva, the prescribed ritual, should lead to spontaneous intention. Okay, so that therefore I'm not a poet, and if I were to rely on my poetic English writing skills to write a prayer to respond to how I'm feeling in the moment, I couldn't do that 3 times a day, let alone once a day or once a week. So the rabbis, though, said still we should pray 3 times a day to respond to what's going on in the world around us and what has happened in our lives over the course of the day. And so they have the words written there so that it might lead us to say, and I'll add this thought to this prayer. Okay, so the same with the rituals in the temple and bringing the sacrifice. How do I respond to the birth, the joy of a birth of a child, or the bountiful harvest that I brought in this year? Well, you respond by bringing of the harvest. You respond by bringing an animal, bird, or a handful of grain to the joy that is you're experiencing in your life, and that ritual embodies the emotion. Okay, so now up to the quotation marks here on the right-hand side of 585. Ritual is a way of giving voice to ultimate values. Each of us needs a sense of holiness to navigate the relentless secularity of our lives. For the Israelites of biblical times, it must have been gratifying to know what to do when they wanted to approach God at crucial moments of their lives, in need or in gratitude. All right. I want to read 2 more paragraphs of this. Hopefully we'll have enough time for this. I want to go on to 586 on the left-hand side, the paragraph that begins Maimonides. So this is about sacrifices themselves. Maimonides believed that God did not savor this manner of worship, lest people assume that they were feeding God, who would go hungry without their gifts, right? So for Jewish philosophers, right, from the Middle Ages, like Maimonides, the idea, okay, let me step back a moment. The temple was destroyed. Jewish worship has evolved to prayer as a substitute for sacrifice. The question is, are we going to go back and revert to bringing sacrifices again? So traditional prayers say 3 times a day, we're hoping for the temple to be rebuilt in Jerusalem and for sacrifices to be offered again. The conservative movement changed the future tense. We look forward to bringing sacrifices to, we remember how we brought sacrifices. So the conservative movement prayer book doesn't necessarily look forward to bringing sacrifices, but it does look forward to rebuilding the temple. Okay, so it makes a little bit of a difference there in what we're looking forward to. Okay, so that So we can look forward to rebuilding a temple. There's no reversion in our spiritual evolution in that because of how the temple could unify the people. But there would be that most conservative Jews would agree we're not looking forward to slaughtering animals again, right? Again, I'll pick on Gabe. We're not looking forward to Gabe having to bring animals to Gabe so he can shech them and offer them up for us on our behalf. Okay, I don't think Gabe is looking forward to that himself, and I don't think we would be looking forward to that. That's quite different from the Judaism that we are performing today. So Maimonides has an issue with that. Jewish thinkers from the Middle Ages to today, how do you make sense of these sacrifices today? Why are we doing them? Are we doing them because we think God wants them? Or are we doing them to reflect something that's from us, right? Is it a one-way thing or is it a two-way thing? Are we offering it because of it's responding to a feeling from the inside and we're offering it because God wants it? Or is it just from us? Okay, so Abravanel, who lived a couple hundred years after Maimonides, too, suggests that God never intended to call for animal offerings. After the Israelites worshiped the golden calf, however, God recognized the inability of people to deal with a totally abstract notion of the divine, and at that point ordained the details of the sacrificial system. Okay, so in other words, sacrifices were put in. So perhaps the book of Leviticus would not have been necessary if there would not have been a golden calf, right? If the people had not fashioned the golden calf and started dancing and singing all around it and worshiping it, perhaps then Moses wouldn't have broken the first set of 10 commandments, and perhaps there would be a whole other system that would have been in play to how to worship God. But because God saw that the people needed sacrifices, and that everybody else in the world were offering sacrifices so that the people, the Israelites knew nothing else. So you had to come up with an Israelite version of the sacrificial system. It's just like why we're allowed to eat meat. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve didn't kill animals to eat. They only ate fruits and vegetables. It's as a result of Noah and the ark, and why the humanity had to be destroyed in order to save Noah, that God compromised and said, okay, clearly human beings have this animal instinct to kill. So we'll focus that drive onto slaughtering an animal in a particular way and do consumption that way of animals that way. So we'll limit the human drive with a compromise and an understanding that it needs to be satisfied. So this need of sacrifices needs to be satisfied. So we'll come up with an Israelite worship system for that. So the paragraph goes on, just as God does not need our prayers, although we need to pray, God does not need our sacrifices, although we need to offer them to feel God's nearness. Okay, so prayer responds to an emotion, sacrifice responds to an emotion. You want to give something of yourself in response to what happens in your life. We recognize this feeling in the eagerness of people to offer donations to charity to accompany their prayers or memorial observances, right? God forbid when Israel's existence is at stake, right? 6-day war, Yom Kippur war. Jewish community came out of the woodwork and bought Israel bonds in support of Israel, right? The same kind of idea. Something is the matter. We come out and give money to support, right? What's happening in Ukraine. So federation comes up, our local federation comes up with a donation page. 100% of our money will go to refugee relief and support of Jews who are still in the Ukraine, right? It shows that there's something we can do. Here's what we're doing, giving of ourselves. So that the paragraph concludes the cult, that is organized worship through sacrifice, is not man's kindness to God, but God's kindness to man. Okay, so any questions or comments on this? Because I need to end a bit before 12 o'clock because I have a 12 o'clock Zoom session to go to. Any questions or comments about this? Thoughts? So I went out of the way to do all this because, and Eitz Chaim went out of its way to do this because as we get into the nitty gritty, the details of which are pretty gross about the animals that are being sacrificed, and also about the ritual purification section, which I'll pick on Gabe again. His daughter's bat mitzvah last year was on that section, was on the Shabbat of that section. So it's disgusting stuff, and you wonder where the spirituality is in all of it. And so that's why we need to be reminded, as the commentary does, of what it's all about, what the bigger picture is, and that it's not so different today. That the needs of the Bible and the response to it are no different than the similar needs. What happens with our bodies and how we can overcome. How do we respond to emotions in a spiritual way? All right, so have a good rest of the day, everybody. Stay safe and healthy, and see you all next Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.